Hello everybody. Today I'm at South Greenford. South Greenford is one of the least used stations in London, but it's also what I would call a halt. Now, a few people have asked me what a halt is and how it differs from a station, so I think this is a good opportunity to answer that question, as best I can. South Greenford itself is on the West Ealing to Greenford branch line, which I talked about recently in another video. The purpose of this line was to connect the old Great Western Railway's main line to Bristol with their main line to Birmingham. The stations along the way were just kind of a bonus, a way for the Great Western to cash in on this shortcut of theirs. The line was built in 1903, but South Greenford was a late addition. It was put on the line in 1926, although funnily enough the station dates from 1904. Now this is all very cryptic and self-contradictory. So let's go back to the beginning. Let me explain to you what a halt is. The short and not very helpful answer is that a halt is a very basic station. Different companies had different definitions and were often rather imprecise. But fortunately for us, the Great Western Railway actually did have a specific set of criteria by which a halt could be defined. I mean, they would do, they basically introduced them to Britain. So we all know what a railway station is. It's a designated, regular stopping point where a train can pick passengers up and set them down. In the steam age, stations also handled goods, with long-distance lorries not becoming common until the middle of the 20th century. The station was also often the goods distribution point for a town. In the 19th century, effectively, the railways had a monopoly on land transport. Sure, there were carts, carriages and buses, but they were horse-drawn, therefore slow, short distance, and of limited capacity. In the 1870s, street tramways started appearing in Britain's towns. Horse trams were nothing new. In fact, they were almost as old as the steam locomotive in concept. But it wasn't until 1870 that clear legislation was brought into force that drastically simplified the process of building street tramways. At first, the railways weren't too bothered because a tram back then was basically just a more energy-efficient horse bus. But the railways were to get a rude awakening come the end of the 20th century with the introduction of electric trams and the arrival of motorised buses. For the first time, vehicles on the roads could compete with local trains, and they also had a clear advantage. You couldn't build stations everywhere, there wasn't space, and a steam train does not do well with frequent stops and starts. Trams and buses have no such problems. The Great Western Railway was particularly concerned by all of this. They had a lot of short branch lines for local traffic, just the sort of thing that the new modes of transport threatened. So they looked to continental Europe and particularly France and Belgium. Over there, what was quite common was roadside light railways. Not quite a street tram, not quite a conventional railway. These had frequent but specified stops, what were known as halts, H-A-L-T-E. Actually, there was a very similar type of line within Great Western Territory, in the form of the independent Wantage Tramway in Oxfordshire, which used small engines and tram cars. This is one of the small engines of the Wantage Tramway. I just really like this engine. Anyway, the GWR looked into how they could adapt this concept to their own lines. The first step was to come up with a kind of train that could run efficiently with a light load and frequent stops. These were initially known as motor cars, but quickly became known as rail motors. Somewhat confusingly, the meeting minutes from 1904 discussing the concept use the term motor cars, which they used to mean rail motors, buses, and regular cars. Rail motors were essentially coaches with a small steam engine built into them. They could run on their own or haul a trailer coach. The second step was to introduce the concept of the halt. Out in the countryside, a halt was just where the train officially stopped. There was no structure, really. The rail motors had retractable steps and would set the passengers down at the line side. In the London area, though, halts were more substantial. Wooden platforms, typically fitted with one of these pagoda-style corrugated iron shelters. But they were small and they were cheap. They could be added to existing branch lines with minimal adaptation. In the early days, halt was spelt in the French style, but from 1905 they began to officially spell it without the E. Maybe someone told them they were being pretentious, I don't know. The GWR had a specific definition for a halt. It was a short station with no staff and no signal attached to it. Typically, stations had a signal at the end of the platforms, for the simple reason that if there was a problem up the line, it was preferable to hold the train in the station rather than stop it in the middle of nowhere. Now, this isn't part of the official definition, but halts also didn't have goods yards attached to them. One early halt was at Trumpers Crossing on the Brentford branch. There's still a foot crossing there, although there's not much else to see. The trumper in question was a landowner who was apparently opposed to the railway, ironically. This halt was not very successful, and in 1926 it closed. But meanwhile, in the area around Ealing, Greenford and Perivale, industry was springing up and houses for the workforce would soon appear. The GWR therefore decided to open a new halt on the Greenford branch at South Greenford. They simply dismantled Trumpers Crossing Halt and reassembled it here. The Greenford platform is still timber, but on the West Ealing side it's been replaced by something more substantial. While individual halts might have failed, halts as a concept were a great success. Soon other railways were adopting the concept. They weren't all defined by the same rules. For instance, some companies defined a halt as a request stop, not in the regular timetable. But by and large, if you described a station as a halt, people knew roughly what you meant. Actually, in some cases, halts were too successful. Rail motors were a good concept, but they were limited. They couldn't haul more than one carriage, they couldn't take a goods wagon with them, and they were only suitable for one kind of work. They also couldn't be kept clean like coaches because they had to be kept with the locomotives. So having made all that fuss because conventional trains weren't suitable, the GWR now decided that rail motors weren't suitable for the job they had specifically been designed for. I do not have a record of the locomotive department's reaction to this decision. In the 1930s, the GWR returned to the rail motor concept with what we call rail cars. Same basic concept, but powered by diesel. These still had their limits, but they were stronger and cheaper to operate than the steam motors. Anyway, halts. Some halts were so popular that they ended up getting upgraded. The GWR introduced a new concept known as the platform. This was a longer station, capable of holding a full-length train, usually staffed by 1 or 2 people. Long before it was an underground station, Perivale started out as a halt, but was subsequently upgraded to the status of platform. But the term didn't catch on in the way halt did. Partly because the GWR became quite vague about what the difference was between a halt, a platform, and a station. They had definitions, but they didn't stick to them. There were platforms they called halts, halts they called platforms, platforms called stations, and just about every other permutation you can think of. The term platform, as a class of station, did not outlast the GWR. One way or another, the term halt became quite loose, and I haven't been able to find one single covers-all-bases definition that applies across the entire country, though there are plenty of people who will confidently tell you what they believe the definition is. Hence the fact that I came to a former GWR halt where I am on firmer ground. The Great Western Railway was nationalised in 1948, becoming the western region of British Railways, and in the 1950s something interesting happened. British Railways started experimenting with rail buses. These were basically a development of the railcar concept, but smaller. And so a new era of halt building began, even smaller than the GWR ones, including the best-named stop ever, Trouble House Halt in Gloucestershire. But this was short-lived because the 1960s would see the beaching axe, the closing down of unprofitable lines and stations. This was a controversial move and still is. It saw the end of many of the old halts, some of which would ultimately have a life of only a few years. Unfortunately, cost-cutting also meant that the following years would see many stations downgraded as staff were removed. In fact, the term halt fell out of use, because frankly it was getting embarrassing. Some quite large stations were now effectively halts, having no goods facilities or staff. These days the term halt is rare, but the concept is still very much in use. I'd argue that many stations are now effectively halts, even if they didn't start out as such. Increased automation has meant that stations are frequently unstaffed, for better or for worse. Even quite busy stations. Station buildings are turned to other uses. The booking office is replaced with a ticket machine, the porters with "you'll just have to carry your own bag." So really, these days, I don't think you can effectively differentiate between a station and a halt. But at least the Great Western Railway had a go. Well, I do hope you enjoyed today's video. If so, please do leave a like and subscribe for more. I have to say, South Greenford is not an appealing station. It's located next to a dual carriageway, and to give you an idea of the service level, when I'd finished filming for this, I checked my travel app to see how best to get home. While I was standing on the actual platform of the actual station at actual South Greenford, it advised me to walk to Perivale Tube Station. Anyway, I would like to thank my donors on Ko-fi, on Patreon, and here on YouTube for your generous support. You are the E on the end of my halt. And I will see you all again very soon. Cheerio.